After 22 years in the service, most of them spent breathing in the dry, metallic dust of places the world forgot. I thought I knew what a real fight looked like, but it turns out I hadn't seen anything until I met a woman named Beatrice and the board of the Pine Ridge Estates. I didn't come back to my family's land in the valley to start a war. I came back to rebuild a life that had been fractured by too many deployments and enough night raids to last a lifetime. And all I wanted was to fix up my late father's old 1968 John Deere and grow enough heirloom corn to feel like I was part of the earth again. My name is Elias Thorne, and I moved back to a modest 60-acre plot that had been in the Thorne family since the days when people still used horses. But while I was away, the world around my fence line had changed, transforming from rolling hills into a sea of beige stucco, manicured lawns, and people who measured their self-worth by the height of their hedges. The trouble started on a Tuesday, just 3 days after I'd hauled my gear into the old farmhouse, and I was standing there with grease up to my elbows, trying to coax that old green tractor back to life, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a luxury SUV crunching gravel where it didn't belong. I looked up to see a silver Mercedes parked right at the edge of my driveway, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been professionally laminated, clutching a leather-bound clipboard like it was a holy relic. She didn't oppose, offer a greeting, or in quote, welcome home, end quote. She just looked at the oil stain on my shirt with a sneer that would have withered a cactus and told me her name was Beatrice, the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I told her as politely as a tired veteran can that I wasn't oppose, part of her little club because my land was zoned agricultural and had been here long before her, end quote. Estates, end quote, were even a blueprint, but she just smiled that thin, terrifying smile of someone who has never been told no. She told me that while I wasn't and oppose, technically a member, my end quote, aesthetic choices, end quote, were an eyesore that affected the property values of the million-dollar homes on the ridge, and she suggested, well, she demanded that I move my, end quote, industrial debris, end quote, into a concealed structure immediately. I remember staring at her and feeling that old, familiar heat rising in my chest, but I just wiped my hands on a rag and told her to get off my property before I decided to file a trespassing report, and for a second, I thought the sheer audacity of an old soldier might actually send her packing. But Beatrice wasn't oppose, a normal neighbor. She was a predator who weaponized bureaucracy, and over the next month, she turned my quiet homecoming into a psychological siege. First came the anonymous tips to the county about, end quote, unsanitary conditions, end quote. Then the drones that would hover over my cornfields at dusk, their little red lights blinking like the eyes of a mechanical vulture, and then the letters, dozens of them, citing obscure local ordinances that didn't and oppose even apply to my zoning. It was a slow-motion invasion, and every time I saw her Mercedes idling at the fence line, I felt like I was back in a foxhole, waiting for the first mortar to drop, and I realized that to her, my freedom was a personal insult to her control. The tension finally snapped on a sweltering afternoon in late August during the height of the harvest, and the air was thick with the smell of sweet corn and diesel as I was moving the John Deere down the old access road that connects my east field to the main barn. This road is an easement, a narrow strip of gravel that I legally own but allow the county to use, and I'd pulled the tractor to the side to clear a clogged intake when I heard a roar of an engine that sounded way too fast for a residential zone. I looked up and saw Beatrice's Mercedes screaming down the gravel, and she wasn't oppose. Slowing down, she wasn't oppose. Swerving, she was just coming, and with a sickening crunch of expensive German engineering meeting heavy American steel, she slammed right into the side of my front axle. I stood there, stunned. She tumbled out of the driver and oppose. A seat, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the impact, and before I could even ask if she was hurt, she had her phone out and was screaming into it, telling a 911 operator that an, end quote, unstable local, end quote, had used a tractor to ram her car in an unprovoked attack. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the dust, watching her perform this elaborate drama for the police, and when the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, a young guy named Miller who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, Beatrice went into full-blown victim mode. She was shaking, pointing at the tractor like it was a sentient monster, and claiming that I'd been, end quote, menacing, end quote. the neighborhood for weeks, and that this was the final straw. Miller looked at me, then back at the wreck, and I could see the doubt in his eyes, but then I pointed to the weathered fence post near the gate where I'd hidden a high-definition, motion-activated trail cam just a week prior after she'd started her drone flights. I told Miller I had the whole thing on a cloud sync feed, the way she accelerated into a stationary vehicle, the way she didn't and oppos, to even hit the brakes, and most importantly, the part where she got out and kicked the tractor in oppos, as headlight until it shattered to make the damage look worse. The look on Beatrice's face when she realized I had the footage was worth every penny of my military pension. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror that stripped away all that polished arrogance in a heartbeat. But I didn't in oppos. T stopped there because once you've been pushed into a corner by a bully, you don an oppos. T just pushed back. You redefine the battlefield. And I spent the next 3 days in the basement of the county records office digging through 20 years of Pine Ridge HOA filings. What I found wasn't an oppos. T just a neighbor who was a bit of a jerk. It was a systemic criminal enterprise because Beatrice had been running that HOA like her own private fiefdom, and the books showed hundreds of thousands of dollars in quote, maintenance fees and quote, paid to a shell company owned by her brother and all, with not a single blade of grass actually being cut by a professional crew. She'd been using the HOA dues of all those beige stucco homeowners to fund her lifestyle, and she'd been using her in quote, aesthetic standards and quote, to bully anyone who might look closely enough to see the rot beneath the surface. I didn't in oppos. T go to the police first. I went to the people, and I spent an entire night printing out a factual, cold-blooded summary of the crash footage, the fraudulent filings, and the secret bank accounts, and I hand-delivered a packet to every single mailbox in Pine Ridge Estates. By the time the sun came up, the neighborhood wasn't in oppos, T in manicured paradise anymore. It was a hornet's nest, and the emergency board meeting that night was the closest thing I've ever seen to a civilian coup. Beatrice tried to scream about, in quote, fake news, in quote, and in quote, veteran instability, in quote. But when I walked into that clubhouse and projected the video of her crashing into my tractor onto the big screen, the silence was absolute. She was voted out before the video even finished playing, and the sheriff's deputies were waiting at the back of the room to take her in for insurance fraud and filing a false police report. And as they let her out, she looked at me with a hatred so deep it felt like a physical weight. The Mercedes is gone now, replaced by a much humbler sedan driven by a new board member who actually knows how to say hello, and the end quote, for sale, end quote, sign in front of Beatrice's house has been there for months because nobody wants to buy a home that's tied up in a massive fraud audit. My John Deere is back in the field, scarred but running better than ever. And sometimes as the sun goes down, I see my neighbors from the ridge standing at my fence line, just watching the corn wave in the breeze, and they don an oppos. They look at me like an eyesore anymore. They look at me like a man who reminded them that you can't build a community on a foundation of lies. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and it's something I want to ask all of you. Was I right to burn her world down, or did I just become a different kind of bully by using her own tactics against her? I got my piece, but I destroyed a woman and oppos. That's entire life in the process. And I wonder if justice is always supposed to feel this heavy, or if I just brought a little bit of the war back home with me. Leave a comment below and tell me if you think I went too far, or if some people just need to be reminded that the man behind the fence has a lot more than just corn buried in his field. I really want to know what you think. Did the ends justify the means?